Yeah, hello and welcome to my first online lecture here for the VHS Solingen. We are going to talk today about the relationship between England and Scotland. And the title you see here is Caledonia and Britannia. Those are the old Latin terms the Romans used for Caledonia, Scotland, and Britannia, England. Which will come up during the lecture. Unequal sisters is the question we are asking today. You will have a very Caledoniocentric lecture today, meaning the viewpoint from Scotland on the relationship between England and Scotland, because Scotland, of course, is the much smaller partner, so it was much more affected by the English attitude than the other way around. Briefly want to introduce myself. I've done a couple of lectures here at the VHS in German and in English. I've studied in England and I did my doctorate in England. That's the reason why I think I'm able to give this talk in English. Sorry that I can't give you a proper Scottish accent, have to do this in a rather English voice. My name is Ulrich Morgenroth. I'm a doctor of archaeology and history, so I think that's a pretty good start to talk to you about the history of Scotland and England. Here we have a view of the British Isles. We have the British mainland with England. To the west is the Welsh Peninsula, Wales. Then we have Northern Ireland to the west, and coloured in red on top we have Scotland. The divide between England and Scotland is not just cultural, but also geological, because you have very strong Scandinavian volcanic influences in Scotland, so there's a difference as well. And there's a very old historical difference. We have a view here of Hadrian's Wall. This was the divide between the Roman part of the British Isles and the non-Roman parts. The Romans had started in the 40s after Christ to conquer Britain and then pushed their borders northwards, but came to a stop at a place which today lies in England but very close to the Scottish border. In 122 AD, the Emperor Hadrian started to build a wall to separate the two. After that, there were some attempts of the Romans to extend their territory further north, but that in the long run was unsuccessful. So in the end, more or less, we have a divide here that goes back to Roman times. Here we have a map of Scotland itself, and some of you might have the idea of this sort of unity of Scotland. Everybody running around in kilts with bagpipes, singing merry songs. So from the outside you sometimes have the feeling it's a very unified nation, but that's not quite true, because you have distinct territories which differ linguistically, culturally and historically. Mainly on the mainland you have the lowlands, which are the parts in the south bordering England, and that's where the Scots live. The Scots talk a Western Germanic language which is not too unlike English and always was under a fairly strong English influence. Even the Normans came into the lowlands in Scotland, and a lot of the aristocracy there was Norman. Then you have the Highlands in the north, and that has a very strong Celtic tradition. Initially, all of Britain was Celtic, and with Germanic tribes invading, the Celtic languages and cultures were ever more pushed to the fringes. Ireland and Wales on one hand, and the Scottish Highlands. And the Scottish Highlands is where you have this clan structure, which is so famous, where the MacLords, where the MacGregors and all these famous clans lived. And then you have the Isles. You have the Hebrides to the west, and you have the Northern Isles to the north, and they always were very Scandinavian. In fact, the Orkney and the Shetland Islands until the very late belonged to the Kingdom of Norway. And there's still a very strong tradition there which links them to Scandinavia rather than to the rest of Scotland. So this diverse territory was ruled by a number of very different tribes, by different rulers, and only started to be unified in the Middle Ages, starting with King David I. And even more influential was his son, King Alexander II, who lived between 1214 and 1249. He basically was the one who unified, and unified means conquer every bit by. Unification in that time was nothing peaceful, was always a deed of war, basically conquered one part of Scotland after the other, and unified the Scots with the Highland people, so he had one unity there. The whole development got further after his death in 1249, and was then pressed by his son Alexander III, which started to conquer the islands as well. So by the later reign of Alexander III, you basically have what today is known Scotland being unified in one nation. One big problem with Alexander III, who was a great ruler, who was very influential, who unified the country, was he had no male heir. And that's the basic problem we will find all through the history of Scotland, that whenever a male heir is missing and when you have different people trying to contest for the kingship, you run into problems. On a dark night, on the 19th of March in the year 1286, he wanted to visit his young wife, took on his horse in a very stormy night, got lost and was only discovered a day later, and that was when trouble started. This basically gave rise to a development which is called the Scottish Wars of Independence. He had no male heir. He had a daughter who was married to the King of Norway, but daughters were not very well presented in inheritance lines there. And there were two contestants for the throne, two families who had more or less an equal right to the throne. One was the family of Bruce, which we are going to meet later, and the other one was the family of Balliol. And because they couldn't quite decide in Scotland, the nobility, the different lords, the dukes and counts, which one to favor, they asked someone to mediate. And the person they asked to mediate was the English king, Edward I. And that turned out to be a very, very bad idea, because Edward I was very aggressive in his politics. He was the one who actually conquered Wales, which is pretty much the first colony of the British Empire until the present day. He favored John Balliol because this one was the weaker person in the contestant, and suggested to the Scottish lords to crown John Balliol as king. The problem in that was that he said, okay, he's going to be king, but I will be his overlord. So I will be higher in the hierarchy than he is, and he will have to accept that in order for me to actually favor him as the next king of Scotland. And that was basically what he did, and that caused great unrest because the English influence on Scotland became very, very strong. And the whole thing escalated when he tried to force the English lords to fight in his war against France. So basically take people from Scotland to fight in an English war. And that was something that people weren't happy about at all. The nobility, the high aristocracy, didn't do much about it, and the resistance basically started in the lower aristocracy and with the common people. And there emerged one ruler, or one leader particularly, who was described in the famous Mel Gibson movie, Braveheart, which as a movie is so inaccurate, you shouldn't believe one thing it says. This one was Sir William Wallace of Elderslie. He basically started to call upon the lower aristocratic classes, gather peasants, started to arm them with whatever they had, so pikes, not swords, and they would make their makeshift weapons, started to train them in battle, so that was not a professional army, but rather something like a guerrilla army, and then he started to confront Edward I with his resistance. The whole thing escalated in one famous battle. On September the 11th, in the year 1297, William Wallace fought the English army at the Battle of Stirling Bridge. What you see here is the Wallace Monument, which was erected there much later as a national symbol for Scotland near Stirling Bridge. But here you have a view of the territory. You have this river meandering through a valley and creating marshland. So it's very wet down there. It's very soggy, it's very boggy. And that was one thing that William Wallace took as his advantage. He basically lured the British army, which consisted of knights on horses, so in very heavy armor, to go into the swamp. And what they did, they basically were sucked up by the bog, and the lightly armed Scottish guerrillas, as I said earlier, had a very easy game, basically annihilating this, military speaking, much stronger English force. As you imagine, a king like Edward I would not be too much impressed by this resistance of these sort of normal people, and basically took care that in the next battle, which occurred a year later in 1298, he would be a much better terrain, and there his highly skilled knights, and on the other hand his archers using longbows, which was a very strong weapon at the time. A longbow was a very new invention. It was so strong when you shot with it that you could go through plate armor with the arrows. They could basically create, having hundreds of archers firing at the same time, like a shower of arrows going down, which absolutely shattered and broke the Scottish resistance to a halt completely. William Wallace managed to escape and could hide, nobody's quite sure where, for some time. But ultimately, in 1305, was given by Scottish nobles over to the English, was brought to London, and in Westminster Hall tried and found guilty of high treason, which basically was pretty much the worst thing you could do at the time, and which had the worst penalty you could get. You had to be drawn, hanged, and quartered. Was drawn at the back of a horse through the city of London. His eyes were cut off, his genitals cut off, and then he was disemboweled and cut into 4 pieces. His head was put on a pike and put up on Westminster Bridge in order to deter people from trying anything like that ever again. But that didn't stop Scottish resistance, and then someone arrived on the scene which has a name we have heard before. This was Robert Bruce, and you might remember that side of the Balliol family, the Bruces were the other noble family which had a legitimate claim to the Scottish throne. Here's the monument of Robert the Bruce in Edinburgh, born 11th of July 1274, died on the 7th of June 1329. He was to start with in favor of King Edward, and at the beginning of the Wallace Rebellion sided with the English, and only later changed side over to the Scottish. He gained the trust of the nobles of Scotland, yet again not by convincing, but conquering one castle after the other, subjecting one royal aristocratic family after the other, and had the support of the bishops of Scotland, which of course was very important at the time, and was crowned King of Scotland without the consent of Edward I on the 25th of March in the year 1306. This, of course, made the British king very, very angry, and he came with an armored force and fought a number of battles. There was favors going one way or the other. Robert the Bruce was very, very ruthless when it came to annihilate his contestants. So anybody from the Scottish side who sided with the English or tried to get in his way was assassinated. And finally, at the Battle of Bannockburn in the year 1314, Robert the Bruce managed to defeat the British army. Finally, that was the victory that made him. Part of his success was that Edward I had died shortly beforehand, and Edward II, the son of Edward I, was not so skilled as a battle leader, so that decided this on the Scottish side. And we then, after this long time after the death of Alexander III, have a proper English king, Robert I of Bruce. After his reign, which was very successful, there were some problems as well. He didn't have a male heir, so he decided that his grandson from his daughter should be the next in line, Robert II, and his daughter was married to a Scottish nobleman named Stuart. And that's how the Scottish royal family became the family of Stuart. And of course the most famous Stuart is Mary, Queen of Scots, who is the play by Schiller about her, lots of novels, because of her tragic life and the fact that she had a very tragic death. And she was mother to King James IV of Scotland. As I said, what she is mostly known about is her conflict with the neighbor again, this time Queen Elizabeth I of England. They both had a claim to the throne, and as I said, sort of women in lines of inheritance are always rather problematic. She tried to form a conspiracy against Elizabeth I, so she was not the innocent she's very often made in the plays and the books. So she was tried and then decapitated for plotting against Queen Elizabeth I. Here we have Elizabeth, very, very important Queen of England. The Elizabethan Age, one of the most successful periods in English history, is named after her. And what's very, very important is that she was a Protestant monarch. Her father, Henry VIII, had broke with Rome, so reformed the church in England, which spread into Scotland, and basically by her reign most parts of England and Scotland were not Catholic anymore, but Protestant. Very importantly, her sister, who was on the throne before her, called Mary Tudor, didn't like Protestantism and had a very, very violent campaign of trying to re-Catholize people in England. And that was so traumatic that after that, everything that smelled of Catholicism, both in Scotland and in England, was absolutely appalling to everyone. She was the Virgin Queen, never married, maybe because she didn't want to share her power with a man she thought inadequate, but that again caused the problem that there was no male heir to the throne. And the next in line was the son of Mary, Queen of Scots, the James IV of Scotland, who became James I, King of England. So that was when the union between Scotland and England was formed. So it wasn't an act of war or an act of violence, but you could almost say that Scotland took over England rather than the other way around. He reigned until 1625, until his son, King of Scotland and England, so the double crown, became king in 1925, and he was known as Charles I. If there were people in history who knew how to get into trouble, those were the Stuarts. His grandmother was beheaded, as I said earlier, and he was very much in favor of the absolute monarchy, something that we know from the Sun King of Louis XIV and in France, and he wanted to have absolute power, and that was something that didn't go well with the tradition in England and in Scotland, because since Magna Carta in the 3rd century, you had a very strong parliamentary tradition in these countries. The lords would asked to be part of ruling the country. And he got into trouble because he wanted money and called in parliament and got into a dispute with the lords of the land, which basically led to the first revolution in England, the Civil War, where over several years parliamentary forces were fighting the forces of the king. Here we have the Union Jack, which today is in its form after 1801, the flag of the United Kingdom coming from the Union that I already described. And we see here on top we have St. George's Cross and St. Andrew's Cross, England and Scotland, and then the whole thing merges into a double flag, the Union Jack, to which later on the Red Andreas Cross of Ireland is added to the modern form. But you can see here that the double crown, the two kingdoms, are also represented in the flag. As I said, Charles I had run into trouble and was finally defeated by the Parliament army, which was led by Oliver Cromwell, who was a genius in warfare, who was a very, very strict Protestant, was a Puritan, was believing that he was fighting with God on his side. And basically they captured the king in 1849. They tried him again in Westminster Hall, where William Wallace was tried, condemned him of high treason, and he was executed the same year. Something absolutely heard of. That one king would cut another king's head off was absolutely normal, but if you had a parliamentary army who tried a king and then executed him, that was something new. And that brought in the subsequent time a new problem, because the lineage of this double kingdom was cut, and now you had Oliver Cromwell, who became head of state basically, without legitimacy to rule Scotland. And that's caused massive, massive problems. There are a lot of rises in Scotland because they weren't very happy with the fact that someone now who was legitimized officially would basically rule the country. When Oliver Cromwell died, for a short while his son tried to take over his post, but wasn't qualified at all. So the lords got together again and then tried to find a way out of the crisis. And since the family of Charles I, who himself was executed, was earlier sent to France and was still living there, they basically called them back and made the son of King Charles I King of Scotland and England in the year 1660. He was very skillful, must have been a very good diplomat, must be very sympathetic, so he managed to basically level the problems the Stuarts had with their kingdomship and parliament and everything fairly well. Great catastrophes in his time. London burned down, the Great Plague was ruining not just the countries in England, but also in Scotland. And when he died, again without a male heir, he called his younger brother, James II, to be King of England. And this one was a completely other kettle of fish. In exile, in France, he had converted to Catholicism, was married to an English Protestant woman first, but after her death married an Italian princess. He had daughters from his first marriage, and everybody now was anxious that if he had a son, there would be another Catholic king to England and Scotland. And as I said, that was something absolutely unthinkable for the British nobility, because basically they smelt the sulfur of the devil as soon as a papist was the term that was there. So, and when a young son was born to James II, they decided they wouldn't do no more and sent a polite invitation to the daughter of King Charles II, who was also a granddaughter of Charles I, because he was married to a cousin, Queen Mary. And she was married to William of Orange. William of Orange was Governor General of the Netherlands. They were both Protestant. She had a good claim on the English throne, so they invited William to basically come over to England and invade, which he did with a large army of Dutch soldiers. You could call that a foreign invasion, but since everybody seemed to be in favor of him rather than James II, it was called the Glorious Revolution. Not everybody was happy with that, so a war started raging in 1689 and 1690, particularly because James II didn't want to give up the throne without a fight. The whole thing was decided in Ireland in the so-called Battle of the Boyne. Still part of the problems in Northern Ireland today. The Battle of the Boyne is where William of Orange put his claim down, and the so-called Orange Orders in Northern Ireland today do their marches on the anniversary of the Battle. But that's not the main subject. So they didn't kill Charles II, but he went off to France again and stayed there, which after a while will become important again, not so much for the moment. So quite happily, Mary and William took the throne. They arranged themselves with Parliament, in England at least, and the English were very happy with them being King and Queen of England and Scotland, because they still had the Scottish claim. The Scottish weren't so well convinced about it, but they did something rather silly in the year 1698. They wanted a colony. Everybody had colonies. The French had them, the Dutch had them, the English had them, and they wanted one for themselves. And they invested a very enormous amount of money to establish New Caledonia, New Scotland, in what today is Panama. And that again was in a place which was covered by jungle, by swamps, and which economically wouldn't produce anything. They established a colony there and then got back to Scotland, got back again 3 years later, and everybody had died. And they had lost so much money and they were so broke that they basically agreed to be bought by the British. The British government, under the sister of Queen Mary, who again had died without a male heir, Queen Anne, settled with the Scots, and both the Scottish and the English Parliament agreed on a contract, a document, the so-called Act of Settlement, which on a legal basis unified the two kingdoms, basically dissolved the Scottish Parliament, so any decision over Scottish matters were taken in England from then until much later. So there were Scottish MPs, or not MPs at the time, but Scottish representatives at the Parliament, and later on there was a Secretary of Scotland, but hardly any local rule for Scotland in Scotland itself. Articles of Union, see here the original document drawn up. Yet again, same old problem. Queen Anne died without an heir. If you want to get into the person of Queen Anne, there has been a movie recently called The Favourite, who won a couple of Oscars at the last Oscars. So she was very secluded, didn't have many contacts. Basically, the country were ruled by other people. Even though the descendants of James II were still sitting in France, being openly Catholic now, making no doubt about it, there was no way they could come back. And one had to think who might be the next in line now, nice, proper Protestant Stuart descendant. And it happened that Charles the First had a sister called Elizabeth, and she was married to Frederick, Kurfürst of the Pfalz. And they had a daughter called Sophia of Hanover, who was married to Ernest Augustus, the Archduke of Hanover. And they had a son called George. And that was the one who basically was invited to take up the English throne. This is Sophia of Hanover. This is her son George, and he became George the First of England and basically firmly established the line of royal descendant that we still have today with the current monarch. As I said, in France, the Stuarts were sitting around, seemingly didn't have much to do, and still pretended to be kings of Scotland. That's why James Edward Stuart, the son of King James II, was called the Old Pretender, because he pretended to be king of Scotland. He made one attempt to invade Scotland with a French fleet, but the weather was so bad, so that didn't happen. So that the only and next serious attempt of the Jacobites, Jacobus is Latin for James, was not made by him, but by his son, who was also called James Edward Louis Casimir Sylvester Severino Maria Stuart, was born in December 1720, and who went into history called Bonnie Prince Charlie. He basically got money from the French and waited until the British were busy elsewhere. And he took his chance in the year 1745, because most of the British troops were not in England at the moment, but on the continent in Austria, fighting the Austrian War of Succession. He landed in Fort Williams, up north, and then started to, with a rather small French force, and started to move on and managed to gather ever more people. So they started with the Highlands clan, and he actually managed, must have been a very, very convincing type, a convincing man. He's still very famous in Scottish folklore as Bonnie Prince Charlie. Lots of songs about them, and started in Fort William. And pretty much like William Wallace, gathered ever more, mostly Highlanders, who conquered one part of Scotland after the other, and basically even got down to Manchester and managed to siege Manchester. This was his standard, his tandem triumphans, together we will win. As I said, was managed to go down to Manchester and then had the decision to walk onto London and basically conquer England, but did decide against it and move back to Scotland. And that was the problem he made, because then the English returned. The Duke of Cumberland, the youngest son, here's a picture by William Hogarth showing how the Scots go basically through the villages, gather and more new people to fight for them. The Duke of Cumberland landed, chased the Jacobite army to a place called Culloden, and that became one of the epithetical places in Scottish history, because that was the final defeat. I said Bonnie Prince Charlie had mainly recruited his soldiers from the Highlanders, so they basically were still armed as soldiers of the Middle Ages. So they had their big swords, they had their pikes, and they had their old muskets. And now they were faced with a sort of proper, very modern 18th century army of trained soldiers who fought in numerous battles on the continent, had been very successful there. And basically in the Battle of Culloden, the Highland forces were completely smashed, annihilated. Bonnie Prince Charlie, being the hero that he was, fled in women's clothes, so dressed as a woman, and was taken on a boat and then safely back to France. That was the very last attempt the Scotch ever made to try to get rid of British rule on a military basis. The English answered with very strong reacting very strongly on that, repressing the tartans, for example, banning the bagpipes, doing nasty things as building roads. Roads are always very good if you want to control an area, so basically modernized in order to suppress. There's a wonderful novel by Robert Louis Stevenson called Kidnapped. It's the story about young David Balfour. There was a TV program in Germany in the 1970s, and that describes how Bonnie Prince Charlie sent people to Scotland to get money out of them in order to pay for his expensive lifestyle in France. Picture here, as I said, you have these red-coated. The red coat is a synonym for the English soldiers basically being confronted with this wild bunch of Highlanders and basically killing them all. Here you have the memorial. After the battle, the bones were gathered and were buried in these memorials, and Scottish nationalists go there on the anniversaries of the battle in order to celebrate their defeat. As I said, Bonnie Prince Charlie went back to France, had one son who moved to the Vatican, became a cardinal, so no further offspring there. And all the three Stuarts, James II, James Edward Stuart and Bonnie Prince Charlie, are buried in St. Peter's Cathedral. You can actually go there and see their tombstone. And now comes an interesting bit. As we've seen with the other line of Stuart, these titles are still going down through various families. And if today a Jacobite ruler wanted to become King of England and Scotland, that would be Count Francis of Bavaria, also Franz von Bayern. Today, of course, the claimant on the Scottish throne is Elizabeth II, who directly descends from George I, came into power, was coronated in the year 1952. And a crucial moment for Scotland came very late, only in 1997, because Tony Blair was Prime Minister then. And since the United Kingdom had always ruled from London, was extremely decentralized, and that had led to a lot of unrest in Northern Ireland, in Wales, in Cornwall and in Scotland, he decided to transfer some power back into the different nations, because at least Scotland is still an independent state, even though it's in the union with England. And in 1997, the Scottish Parliament was opened in Edinburgh. A Scottish First Minister was elected, which today is, of course, Nicola Sturgeon. To put this question of independence to a complete test, David Cameron, a British Prime Minister who unfortunately, as we know today because of Brexit, was very fond of referendums, started a referendum on Thursday, the 18th September of 1914, with the question, should Scotland be an independent country? It's quite interestingly, because this line I just showed you before, who might be the Jacobite king of Scotland today, was something that was promoted in the press, in the British press at the time, who said, okay, if you vote for independence, you will have a Bavarian on the throne of Scotland. And quite interestingly, I didn't expect it. I thought that would be different. 55.3% of the Scottish people said they wanted to stay in union in Great Britain, in the United Kingdom. While after that, the same Prime Minister started the referendum about Brexit, and in that referendum, the vast majority of Scottish people said that they didn't want to leave the European Union, and that rekindled the whole idea of maybe calling for a second referendum. That is something that Nicola Sturgeon, the current Minister of Scotland, promotes. The problem is that she can't decide it. So that has to be decided in the British Parliament, which at the moment is ruled by Boris Johnson's Tory, who never ever would support a move like that. Anyhow, at the moment, we in their response to the corona crisis, we see that Scotland acts differently from England. So they are very more cautious in the whole thing than the English have been. So that's basically how the union between England and Scotland developed, and what makes it so different from Ireland, for example. Northern Ireland in particular, because Ireland and Wales were conquered. They were colonies, so they're basically colonies of England, while Scotland and England came together basically on a proper legal basis. Thank you for your attention. The whole thing is an experiment. It's the first time we try this sort of virtual talk to you and say goodbye to you for the English, and Marcin Le in Scottish Gaelic, goodbye. Thank you for your attention. Give us lots of clicks so maybe we can continue this. Thank you very much for your attention.